is brought to you by Head Start Basketball.
Probably the number one thing that we do within our practices is the finishing drills. I think basketball is a game of, to me, is a game of who is able to get the best shots in the game. Defensively, you're trying to force people into bad shots. Offensively, you're trying to get shots that are closer to the basket, trying to get shots where you're going to the foul line, shots that are in transition and odd man situations that favor the offense. So offensive rebounding, all those things. So those are the things that we really practice every day.
Jason Leone is the men's basketball head coach at Oswego State in New York. Over the past 12 seasons, Oswego has played in 8 NCAA Division III Championships. The Lakers have finished inside the D3Hoops.com top 25 poll on 5 separate occasions during Leone's tenure. Leone is 9th nationally in the history of Division III men's basketball in career winning percentage and number 1 in the East region among active Division III head coaches with at least 10 years of head coaching experience. Prior to Oswego, Leone brought Keystone College to the program's first ever NCAA Mid-Atlantic Regional Ranking, in addition to amassing a .670 winning percentage. As a player, Leone began his career at NCAA Division I Lafayette College, where he played for 2 seasons before transferring to the University of Rochester. The 3-time Dean's List honoree was a captain of the 1998-99 squad that qualified for the NCAA tournament. On the court, Leone won the UAA individual scoring title with Rochester as a junior and was named All-UAA for both of his seasons with the Yellowjackets. Grab pen and paper before you listen to this episode with Jason Leone, men's basketball head coach at Oswego State. Hey Hoopheads, transform your training this May with our partners and friends at Dr. Dish Basketball. Their Dr. Dish shooting machines are undoubtedly the most advanced and user-friendly machines on the market. Get $3,000 off any commercial machine in the month of May. Learn more at drdishbasketball.com and follow their incredible content at Dr. Dish B-Ball on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. Mention the Hoopheads podcast and save an extra $300 on the Dr. Dish Rebel, All-Star, and CT models. Visit drdishbasketball.com for details. That's a great deal, Hoopheads. Get your Dr. Dish shooting machine today.
This is Dre Baldwin from Work on Your Game Incorporated, and you are listening to the Hoop Heads Podcast. Work on your game.
Prepare like the pros with the all-new Fast Draw and Fast Scout. Fast Draw has been the number 1 play diagramming software for coaches for years. You'll quickly see why Fast Model Sports has the most compelling and intuitive basketball software out there. For a limited time, Fast Model is offering Hoopheads listeners 15% off Fast Draw and Fast Scout. Just use the code HHP15 at checkout to grab your discount, and you'll be on your way to more efficient game prep and improved communication with your team. Fast Model also has new coaching content every week on its blog, plus play and drill diagrams on its Playbank. Check out the links in the show notes for more. Fast Model Sports is the best in basketball. Grab pen and paper before you listen to this episode with Jason Leone, men's basketball head coach at Oswego State. Hello and welcome to the Hoopheads Podcast. It's Mike Klinzing here with my co-host Jason Suckle tonight, and we are pleased to welcome another Jason Leone, head coach of the men's basketball program at Oswego State. Jason, welcome to the Hoopheads Pod.
Hey, Mike and Jay, thanks for having me on. Really excited to be here.
Thrilled to have you on. Looking forward to diving into all the things that you've been able to do throughout your basketball career. Let's start by going back in time to when you were a kid. What are your earliest memories of the game of basketball?
Well, I was very fortunate. I grew up in a coaching family. My uncle, John Leone, was a basketball coach at Lafayette College in the Patriot League for 15 years. And I have another uncle who is a high school coach in the area where I grew up in Syracuse, New York, Christian Brothers Academy. And then my father was, very active in coaching in Syracuse as well, in youth leagues and things like that. So to say we are a basketball family would be an understatement. So I grew up around the game, was very fortunate at a young age to be able to go to some, great camps and that sparked my interest. John Beeline, when I was growing up, was the head coach at Lemoyne College here in Syracuse, and our family got to be close with him. And he was a tremendous instructor of the fundamentals of basketball, let alone shooting. And I went to all his camps, and I just was really fortunate, to be around the game as much as I was, and met some really good friends along the way. And and then I got to be good enough where I played in a good high school program, and then had an opportunity to play both at Division I and Division III level at high academic institutions. Just got my interest going in the game, and met some great people along the way. And then here we are. I'm 46 years old, and I've been coaching for over 22 years now.
Who was your favorite Syracuse player growing up?
Sherman Douglas. So Sherman Douglas was my favorite. I just loved the way that he played point guard, the way he threw the lob passes to Derek Coleman, Ronnie Cycli. The Big East in the 80s when I was growing up there was nothing like it. And you watch the program, the 30 for 30 and the Requiem for the Big East, and I watched that, and it's an emotional thing because I grew up, and my dad and some close buddies of mine, our dads would drop us off up at the Carrier Dome and give us, $10 or $15, and we get a ticket, sit all the way up at the top of the dome, and all those games drew 30,000 plus. And, we watched Chris Mullen, Patrick Ewing, all those games. And it was, you talk about memorable experiences and things that spark your interest in basketball. Watching that level in the Big East in the late 80s and early 90s was just an incredible experience.
I can only imagine. I mean, I think back to watching Big Monday, sitting on the floor of my living room and pre-remote control, and just having the cable box sitting on top of the TV. And
it was crazy, being a Syracuse fan growing up. And now I've gotten to have a relationship with Coach Boeheim that's really important to me. But I was in fourth grade when Pete Smart hit the shot in 1987 to beat Syracuse in the championship game. And I remember I was in fourth grade, and I remember watching it with a friend at their house. And my dad picked me up, and it was one of those nights. The game was on late, so I got to stay up late that night. It was such an important experience being a Syracuse fan. They had never really made it that far, and when they lost, I remember going home and crying and saying they're never going to make it this far again. And it's the free throw shooting back in that day was always a sort of a thing that people made fun of Syracuse about. And that game was tough to swallow because they missed some really important free throws down at the end. And anyways, it was just some great times growing up in Syracuse, New York, being a part of just a place that was a basketball crazy city.
Yeah. I mean, when I think of Syracuse basketball, I guess the first guy I always think of is the Pearl. And he was just somebody that when I was a kid, that I'm 53 now, so I'm a couple years older than you. So I remember just watching Pearl Washington and just the things that guy could do. And now you kind of look back on it, you're like, man, the guy had kind of a strange body for a Division I point guard, for a guy who was as successful as he was. And obviously just had a tremendous college career and never quite made it to the same level that a lot of people thought he might as a pro player. But yeah, Syracuse basketball and Big East basketball in general back then, I mean, it's crazy. I was always a North Carolina guy. I had a friend growing up who was always a Georgetown guy. So he and I would go back and forth between Carolina, Georgetown. And college basketball at that time, when you think about the players who played it and just what a different era it was than the era of college basketball that we're in now, which is the college game today is still incredible, but we just don't have the same connection with the players.
No, I think you make a great point, Mike. It's like, when we were growing up and we watched those teams, you could wrap your arms around a program or a team for 3-4 years because you saw those players playing together,
Absolutely.
And that connectedness is something that we don't have now. And it doesn't mean that, there's not a different way that you can fall in love with the game, but it's certainly, there's not a lot of similarities between the way the game was then and the way it was now. But, I still try to focus on the positive, where we have a lot of great memories growing up and watching those teams play. I had a group of guys. I was fortunate enough that had, access to Big East tournament tickets and when I got to be a younger adult and, I was in my late 20s, we had a way that, 4 or 5 of my good buddies, we would go to the Big East tournament every year and watch those games. And we go from like Wednesday or Thursday to Saturday. And
that's awesome.
Just some great memories, and such a high level of basketball, great coaches. And, there's just so much fanfare there and just some of my best memories, not only as a young adult, but even as an adult in my 30s, it was awesome going to those Big East games.
Yeah, I think what's interesting is when you think about the players from that era, and obviously you can associate Patrick Ewing with the Knicks, but I think you can just as easily associate Patrick Ewing with the Georgetown Hoyas and Chris Mullin with the Warriors, but also Chris Mullin with St. John's. And you can just go down the line with guy after guy after guy after guy, where not only what they did as professional players, but their college careers were immensely important to sort of their legacy and how we remember them. And I just don't think that that's not the same really anymore. It's more difficult, I think, because again, those best guys are one and done. And heck, now we're getting to the point, right, where some of the best high school players are not even going and playing college basketball. They're going to all these different, whether it's overseas or overtime elite or whatever it is that they're going to G League. There's just so many more options now for guys. And so it's definitely had an effect on the way we watch college basketball. There's no question that it's way different than when you and I were growing up, and just, as you said, wrapping your arms around a team that was together for 3 or 4 years. And you just knew, hey, this is the Michael Jordan, North Carolina Tar Heels, or this is the Patrick Ewing, Georgetown Hoyas, or this is the Sherman Douglas, Derek Coleman, Syracuse Orangemen. I mean, it's just the way it was back then. And it's never going back. It's not going back to that. So we just gotta kind of enjoy the memories that we had and move forward. When you think about your time as a player growing up, what were some of the things that you did to improve and work on your game when you were a high school player? Because obviously things are different today than they were when you or I were growing up in terms of just AAU and trainers and the difference between being in a gym all the time versus, I'm sure you played some basketball outside on the playground, which when you tell your players, hey, we used to play outside, they probably look at you like you got 3 heads, but totally different growing up in that era versus now. But just talk a little bit about how you improved yourself as a player.
Well, at that point, the high school coaches had much more influence over high school players. To your point, we still hadn't started AAU yet. I played high school basketball between 1990 and 1994 at a really strong Catholic high school program, Christian Brothers Academy in Syracuse, and I played for a Hall of Fame high school coach, Buddy Wiklinski, who's still coaching. We played summer leagues. We got in the gym and we worked together, and we went to the park. And there was no cell phones, so we just knew every day of the week during the summer where the good games were going to be, and that's where we went, and that's where we played. And if you didn't win, you were sitting out for another hour before you got on the court. And there was a great sense about competition that grew from that, and great lessons that were learned, we went and played in these places that right now, in the inner city and stuff like that, I'm not sure, it can't be the same, to your point, Mike. Things change and you've got to adapt, but there was a certain level of toughness and camaraderie that was built with the good old pickup game that you would play. And, an argument over calls, and people didn't call fouls. And if you lost, you sat, and the competitive spirit that grew from that experience was something that I don't think you can replicate nowadays. And it's not that the players nowadays can't develop that. It's just developed in a different way. But, those were some of the things that were really important. It was just getting into the gym. There wasn't air conditioned. There wasn't, beautiful lines on the court, and the courts weren't glamorous and didn't have logos. And, I spent a lot of time in Catholic school gyms that weren't regulation size. But there was something about that was, very romantic, so to speak, and it helped you get better. It helped you meet people. It forced you to go outside your comfort zone. And those are all applicable skills when you want to be a good player.
Yeah, there's no question about it. I always said it numerous times on the podcast that the situation that we have today in terms of the AAU basketball and the way the kids grow up in the game, there's certainly a ton of positives to it, but I'm really glad that I grew up in the era where it was pickup basketball and it was me kind of working on my game on my own. And as you said, I think besides just making me a better basketball player, I think it made me a better person because I had to interact with people of all different races from all different places, all different ages. And like I said, it made me a better player, but I think it also made me a better person and helped me to figure out how to negotiate and figure stuff out and do things that, as you said, kids today can still figure that stuff out. We just have to give it to them in a different way. I'm curious let's talk a little bit about your guys now. When they're trying to play pickup basketball in the off season, where do they go? What do they do? Where do your guys play in the off season when they want to get a game? Because I know that at least around here, it's really difficult when you start talking about trying to find a quote pickup game for college players or even good high school players. It's really, really hard to find those games. Whereas I feel like, to your point, when you and I were growing up, you kind of knew, hey, this gym or this playground on a Tuesday night or a Sunday night, that's where all the players were going to be. How do your guys find those games in the off season?
Well, I mean, while classes are in session, Mike, we've got, one of the really positive things about coaching at Oswego State is we've got a facility that we don't have to share with recreation or intramurals or anything like that. So our gym is borderline exclusively of use to our players. So during classes, we rely on our players to, put together games where they're going to play during the season. Obviously we are unable to do that within the NCAA rules as coaches, but being here 12 years, we've got a environment that's set up where our older guys really do a great job just communicating with our players. This is when we're going to be playing. This is what we're going to be doing. And if we want to be really good, we've got to get in here and we've got to compete together, and push each other. I think when the players go home for the summer, one of the unique things we do is we sit down with every player during the off season and not only ask them what their thoughts are on their game and what their, 2 or 3 things are that they want to improve upon before next season. But after they tell us those things, we say, okay, well, what's your method for how you're going to improve, just to hear what their thoughts are. And it's quite interesting to hear young people nowadays, they may have ideas about what they're going to do, but then they don't really have an answer for what the method's going to be. So at that point, that opens the door for us as coaches and as a coaching staff to say, look, these are things that we used to do. You've got to go outside the box and you've got to be willing to call people in your area where you grew up and say, okay, what are the good summer leagues and where are the good pickup runs? And these are the things you need to do to be a good player. And we encourage them to do that. I think that's a great personal development piece. To your point, where you've got to research and figure out, where these places are where you can play and get better during the summer. I think kids, the players, one of the things I've noticed from coaching as long as I have now is more students are involved at our level with internships and working a lot more than what we did when we were players. I think, kids would go and they maybe wouldn't have as many demanding jobs over the summer and everything was revolved around basketball. Now kids, their life revolves around how they're going to make money. And then when they're done with work, where am I going to play? So that's something that I've noticed over the years has really changed. For us, we encourage them and give them as much input as we can on, how to go about finding these places where they can get better. But it certainly is interesting as an adult to watch the way that they find their way towards improvement. You don't want to interrupt the things that they want to do because Division III is a very unique model. So you want to let them figure some things out for themselves, but at the same time, that they want to improve and there's goals that they have. you've got to be able to nudge them in the right direction.
What are some things that they're doing going in the wrong direction? I'm just curious.
Well, I don't think it's anything that's earth shattering. I think, in terms of going in the wrong direction, they have a lot, these student athletes have a lot of things tugging at their time. I mean,
Yep.
Good things are, internships, things that they want to do during the summer. I think social media and their social lives are, quite a bit different than what they were when we were in college. And again, I think, one of the things I've learned is you want to, at this level, give them some space to figure some things out. But at the same time, you don't want to let them crash and burn, because inevitably, we've all had players that maybe have things that they want to do, and then you watch them go into the following season. Maybe they haven't put in the time, and, you don't want to see them discouraged, and so you've got to, it's certainly a tap dance, so to speak, with, players at our level where you want to push them, but you've got to do it in the right way. I watched something that Rick Pitino said one time, and he's like, everybody's motivated in a different way, right? And part of a coach's job is to have that skill of communication where you can find out what motivates each individual player that you coach. And then you've got to communicate with them in a way where you can find out what makes them tick and motivate them to do things that you need them to do to improve, and that's I really agree with that method.
What does that look like? I'm assuming that at the end of the season here, you kind of wrapped up and you've been going through and having your postseason meetings with your guys. What does that look like in terms of the conversations that you're having with different players based on, again, those different motivational styles or things that each player needs differently in order to push them in the right direction? What are those postseason meetings looks like for you?
Well, this year we took a little bit more time before we met with our players. We've had 2 exceptional seasons in a row where we've set program records for wins. So, we've been 55-6 over the last 2 years, and we've made the Sweet 16 4 times in the last 7 years. And this year we broke through, had a program changing win against Randolph-Macon, made the Elite Eight. So, and we've got a really veteran group right now. We've got 13 of our 14 players returning next year. So we're going to play a lot of 5th and 6th year guys next year. So, going into this off season, I wanted to give the guys a little bit of time to themselves. But in terms of your question, we've met with every guy, and we did a little bit more as a staff, a little bit more listening in these sessions, rather than us dictating what we thought they needed to do. I think one of the things is when you coach an older team, and you can only learn this from coaching for a little bit of a spell, is, you've really got to give them ownership. I think that's a really important thing. You don't want to burn them out from a mental perspective. Especially, we're going to be coaching guys that are 22 to 24 years old next year. And the thing I worry most about at this level, given their, things that tug at their time academically and socially, is I don't want them to be burned out come February 1st, or we're going to have very high expectations for our program next year, as we did going into this year. And I really think it's important. You want them to get certain things done, and you want to communicate with them in a postseason meeting. But at the same time, I really believe less is more. And you've got to give them a little bit of space, especially at this time of year. I think the more they hear your voice, sometimes that can be detrimental towards progress. So, those are some of the things that we focused on this year. I think the way that it's costed us is sometimes we have, we're a slow starting team. In November, I feel like every year we have 1 or 2 head scratching losses. But I think it helps us later in the year. I feel like our team plays well at the right moments, February and March. It's just the model that we've adopted and we believe in.
What are you going to do with your 8 days?
That's a great question. I think the way we're going to handle it is I'm going to first do my practice schedule, for the whole year, a skeleton of that, and then figure out, based on how I've coached the team, as a head coach for 16 years, what days we can spare to do the days that we want to do in the fall. I can tell you right now, we won't do anything in the spring. I just don't think there's enough carryover between the spring and then they go home for the summer and then they come back. And I think that break, the last 6 or 7 weeks after we're done, before they leave for the summer, is therapeutic for the players to be normal college students, both, academically and socially. So it'll be somewhere between 4 and 8 days. I think one of the nice things is there's not an hour limitation. So my gut feeling early on is we're going to take 4 straight weeks, do 1 day in each of those 4 weeks, do kind of some positional stuff for an hour, and then have a team practice. So that's my initial feeling, but I haven't really done a deep dive into that yet.
Let me ask you this, because obviously you had experience as a player at the Division I and the Division III level. And I think back to my time as a Division I player, and I know that it's completely different now in terms of the off season and the demands that both players and coaches have on them, the access that the coaches have to the players. But when I was playing, I know that our season ended and I got handed like a 3-page ditto of like, hey, here's your workouts, man. We'll see you back here. And we'll see you back here in August. Yeah. And obviously it's not that way today. And I often look at it. I still tend to look at a lot of this stuff through a player's lens as opposed to a coach's lens. And I know that, man, I think about these guys that are on campus for 52 weeks a year, and they got the same guys chirping in their ear for that entire time. And I just wonder how you can possibly be at your best and be fresh as a player when you're hearing coaches year round. And conversely, I think from a coaching standpoint too, right? You're with those guys so much. And I kind of heard it in your answer of, you kind of need a break and you need to get away. And obviously that's built into the model of Division III basketball. But I know when I look at what the Division I level does now, I just think, look, I get it that you're getting to work with coaches and players are getting to work with coaches, and there's certainly benefit to that. But I wonder, deep down inside sometimes whether or not that is the amount of access they have. I wonder if it's truly beneficial because of just all the things that you laid out.
Yeah, I think that's a great thought. Our model, one of the things I believe in is collaboration. And I think the longer I do this, I think empowering the players is such an important thing. We coach really intelligent student athletes at our level. And one of the things that I really try to do is I really try to rely on other people. I rely on my staff. And I rely on our players. It's not uncommon for me to meet with players and say, hey, what do you think of this? I'm not afraid of answers that could, that could be, something that, is offensive to a coach. I ask our guys routinely, what do you think of this? Like, what are things that you don't like about our program? What are the things that you don't like about the way that I coach the team? How do you want to be coached? I think sometimes, it could be a scenario where you're afraid of those answers. But to me, sometimes you can open up a can of worms. But my thing is I can find out the things that the players really feel strongly about. And I think the way that you get better is by including other people. I think that I think about it from a corporate standpoint, right? Like I work for somebody. When my boss brings me into her office and asks me my opinion on how things are going or how, I would like to do things, whether it be within my program or within the athletic department, that makes me feel special. And we try to run our program the same way, and I think when people feel empowered within your organization, I think you have a strong organization. I really do. I'm also very clear with the players, that empowerment doesn't include in the middle of the game. I may not ask them what play or what defense we're going to run, but I want them to feel like there's a time and a place where we can agree or we can disagree, but we can get better from that. And, so that's something within our model that I think I've gotten better with. And that direct style of communication, I think people appreciate, especially the people that answer to you. We really try to do a good job of that. I think today's player, I teach a coaching class at our university, and one of the things that there's three different styles of coaches, right? There's the authoritarian model, there's a submissive model, and then there's this cooperative style coach. And I think the cooperative model of coaching is the most effective model of coaching with today's student athlete. And we try to embody that with everything we do.
How far into your head coaching career were you until you got comfortable with having those kinds of honest conversations and seeking that feedback from your players? Was that something you had right away, or was that something you sort of had to build into?
No. I was, and listen, I still consider myself young at 46, but when you first start out, one of the things I noticed is I thought everything was the most important thing. When you problem solve, you want to do everything, get a solution to every problem right away. And the longer you do things, you realize the things that you can be more patient with. Everything doesn't have to be a rock fight, with players or with administrators and things like that. And you learn to, let things marinate a little bit. And, I think, I started out at a very, very small college that was not a high profile college in a high profile league. And I thought I worked through a lot of my weaknesses there. And I was fortunate when I got the Oswego State job, I took over a program that had just made their first ever NCAA tournament. And I inherited a really strong group of seniors. So during that year, I was the one that had to fit in and not screw the thing up. And I thought coaching that team that went undefeated in our league and made the NCAA tournament, I really took a big step forward after from a personal perspective, after coaching that team. And I learned a lot about myself, and I learned a lot about communication, and I learned a lot about coexisting with the people that I worked with. It doesn't mean that I didn't make mistakes after that, but I felt like that was a really, really good professional development piece for me.
What was an early strength as a head coach? And then what would you say was a weakness early on in your coaching career?
I think, I always had the work ethic. So I mentioned to you off air, like one of my first bosses is Tobin Anderson, who I'm sure most people know now, was a coach at FDU, and he's now at Iona. And, working for him as an assistant up at Clarkson, my second year into coaching, I really learned the effort level that you had to put into recruiting and the job, and how competitive coaching was and making your way within the profession. I think a strength of mine was understanding the level of effort that you had to put in to be really good, regardless of level. I thought probably one of my weaknesses was I didn't think I had a great understanding of taking my foot off the gas, with our teams. And again, I just mentioned, one of the things that I think is very hard is when you're pedal to the metal for the whole season, and that's something that you just learn through experience, and having that work-life balance, the longer you do it, you're going to gain that stuff. And sometimes work-life balance has a negative connotation, but I think, the older you get, you figure out, the times when you have to really put great amount of time in. And then there's times where, everything's not the most important thing. There's certain things that can wait.
How do you prioritize and think about what it is that is important day to day? Do you have a process for going through figuring that out? Do you do it through watching film of the previous game, the previous practice? Do you sit down for 15 minutes and just kind of think through it as a discussion with your staff? Just what does that process look like in terms of figuring out, hey, what do we have to do today? How do we prioritize that? Because as you said, it is very easy to think about the million things that you have to do, or that you want to do, or that you want your team to improve on. How do you narrow that down?
Well, I think it's an awesome question because at our level, like I've got assistants that, have secondary jobs. So like I don't have a full-time assistant. Our staff is comprised of two younger guys that they work full-time hours for me, but they're not paid full-time. So one of them is student teaching and the other one does some training on the side just to make ends meet. And then I have a volunteer assistant that's been with the program for over 20 years. So, collaboration is really important to me. And I think it's important to them. So, we each have a specific role within our program based on our strengths and weaknesses. I think, one of the things that I've adopted that I think is really important is I have a weekly meeting with my captains. Sometimes that takes place over a meal. Sometimes it just is a 10 or 15 minute meeting before a practice or after a practice. But how we prioritize things, every team is different. So there's certain years where I may let things sit a little bit more. There's teams I watch more film with than others. There's teams we practice with longer than others. There's certain teams where we have to spend individual time with players more than others. So I think one of the things I believe in is really identifying and relationship building with our players to figure out, okay, what is the best way to coach this particular team? And then from there, that's how we prioritize, what we're going to do in terms of film study, in terms of scouting reports. I know when I first started coaching, our scouting reports were 2, 3, 4 pages long. And now I give my guys 1 page. It's 1 page. We keep this thing pretty simplistic.
When you think about just building the relationships that it takes to be able to have that understanding of each individual player and your teams, how do you go about building those relationships? Is that just sort of the informal conversations? Do you have a formal team building things? What do you do to build the relationships with your guys? How does that happen for you?
Well, we're lucky. I'm at an institution at a public school where, we don't have to mass recruit. I think a lot of times you see at our level, you'll see teams that have 20, 21 guys on the team. Like we had 1 year where it was like that because of this COVID thing that we're working through. And, that's put a wrench into the way people comprise their teams a little bit with people being here 5th and 6th years, but we're almost through all that. But, for me, I think it's really important that we spend, it's almost like the Jerry Maguire thing, like more personal attention, less, people, so we try to identify our models. We try to identify 15 kids that we're really going to go after hard, get to know their families, their high school coaches, all their people that are quote unquote in their circle of trust. And I think that's a really important thing within our model. So it starts there. And then once they get on campus, we spend individual time in 3 areas. Obviously their academic development, their personal development, and then obviously their basketball development. We're able to recruit a smaller number of kids because, our cost of going to school at our institution is typically going to be less than a private school in our state. And from an admissions perspective, we cast a pretty wide net. I've got guys on my team that are first generation college students, and I've also got guys that are, 1350 on the SAT that just, are not going to pay, $75,000, $80,000 to go to a private school, So that allows us to have a very diverse team, not just, in terms of race, but in terms of socioeconomics and geographics within our state. And that helps us to build relationships because we know and we get to know where they come from, what the environment is within how they grew up. And I think the more you know about people personally, the more you ask questions and you listen, it's not a big secret. It's going to help you coach that person, And I think what we've built is we built a program that has been very connected. The players stay invested in our program after they leave. They go on and do great things with their lives. It's been an awesome experience coaching at this particular school. But it takes a lot of time. You've got to be there, and not every kid that's played for me has loved it every second of the time. We do push guys. We are demanding. But I think the thing that really helps us coach these guys hard is that they know we're invested in their personal identity. And, it's been a lot of fun and something that we're really proud of.
When you think about the recruiting process and bringing the right guys in that are going to fit what you're trying to do, and you're obviously, as you said, you're starting to build that relationship even before they set foot on campus as you're beginning that recruiting process. So what does that look like in terms of how do you come up with your initial list of guys that you want to target and go after? And then how do you narrow that funnel as you go through the process?
Well, yeah, it's a great thought because, because we're at a state institution, we're going to have two different types of lists. So, we'll start, obviously we want to have a footprint within a 2-hour radius of our campus. Our program is at this point a little bit more established because of some of the success that's gone on here. So I've noticed that we're able to get involved with a little bit better player now than maybe when I first got here, just because of that type of success. I think, we've gained some national respect within our level and with kids that are along the thruway in New York State. I think we can be a pretty good option for them based on academics and financial, aid and things like that. So we identified, those guys pretty early, that are high school seniors. And obviously, like every college coach, we're going in, we're covering the AAU events and things like that. Although we're doing less and less of that now. Word of mouth has been as important function of our recruiting as anything. And then, we go through the whole year, and like any small college school, there's kids that we really like that, during the normal recruiting cycle are thinking that they want to get a scholarship and play at a higher level, or maybe prep school is an option. So we've got to kind of have a function with rolling admissions where we kind of just hang in there with certain guys. And then once our season's over, we get another list of guys where kids that maybe cross us off the list early, they find out that maybe won't get a scholarship and they need us financially. And then we may get, another list of guys like that. And then obviously the new thing that everybody's dealing with now is the transfer portal. And obviously we do a little bit of that. But, it's like any school. You take a job and you figure out kind of what your niche is, and you adapt to that, every year that changes. I know with, transfer stuff, we've done that quite a bit over my 12 years here, but before the portal, it was kind of word of mouth stuff. And now with the portal, it's become something where, everybody knows about everybody early on. And, you've kind of got to sift through those things, almost like a recruiting list that you get if you covered it in a hoop group or in an AAU tournament. So, it's kind of one of those things in recruiting. You kind of adapt or die. You can complain about a lot of things in recruiting nowadays, but the reality is you kind of got to figure it out, and we certainly try to do that as best we can.
What do you look for in a player in terms of intangibles? I mean, clearly there's a level of skill that you want players to have to be able to succeed at your level. And a lot of times, like you said, you're looking at guys that maybe want to get a scholarship. And those are the kind of kids that you're trying to recruit because you're trying to get players that probably are capable of playing at a higher level. But just what are some of the intangible things that you're looking for? Not so much the skills, but just the things that make your team what it is and build your culture.
Yeah. So obviously at our level, although this is about to change next fall, you want, self-driven people, both academically and personally. And then obviously on the basketball court, we, at our level, we have not been able to work with the players during the off season. So you want people that are driven to and smart enough to know how to get better. we have a saying that, for us, like, success is like about your mindset, and part of your mindset is like, you've got to have a vision for how you want to get better. You've got to have a method for how you're going to do that. And then you got to have the discipline to execute that every day. So that's a pretty unique individual that kind of understands that mindset. And then second thing, I heard about 5 years ago, Ben McCollum, who was the coach at Northwest Missouri State, and is a very accomplished coach at the Division II level. And I think he just took a Division I assistant's job recently here. Anyways, I heard him talk about recruiting one time, and this really resonated with me. One of the intangibles we look for is we don't want moody guys. And he talked about that. And I know that sounds a little trivial, or, however you want to call it. But, I think about the people that I want to spend my days with, and guys who you can't count on being, what they're going to be like emotionally every day. Those guys are difficult to coach, and if I try to do one thing in recruiting from an intangible standpoint, one of the questions I'll ask a high school or AAU coach is, what's this guy like on a day-to-day basis? Are they moody? I think when you can't count on the way somebody's going to be every day from an emotional perspective, that's a really difficult guy to coach, So, we're looking for guys that, aren't moody. I think moodiness really crushes team spirit. So that's certainly a couple things that we look for in players.
Yeah, those guys are draining. I mean, when you have to figure out what you have to do to get the guy to the level that he can be, to be able to practice and be at his best, yeah, that gets old really, really fast. So I can completely understand where you're coming from there. Your first impression is everything when applying for a new coaching job. A professional coaching portfolio is the tool that highlights your coaching achievements and philosophies, and most of all, helps separate you and your abilities from the other applicants. The Coaching Portfolio Guide is an instructional, membership-based website that helps you develop a personalized portfolio. Each section of the Portfolio Guide provides detailed instructions on how to organize your portfolio in a professional manner. The guide also provides sample documents for each section of your portfolio that you can copy, modify, and add to your personal portfolio. As a Hoopheads Pod listener, you can get your Coaching Portfolio Guide for just $25. Visit coachingportfolioguide.com/hoopheads to learn more. Talk a little bit about AAU versus high school. You talked about it a little earlier, how the high school coach used to be way more involved in the process than they are today. And it's one of the things that's interesting, I think, about the recruiting process is how much sort of AAU has taken over in terms of its importance in recruiting. And just, it's obviously easier for coaches to go to one big AAU event and see a ton of players all playing under one roof in one place, as opposed to driving on a Tuesday night to see one high school game. So how do you think about what you're looking for when you watch a player with their high school team versus with their AAU team? Are you looking for different things, the same thing? Do you have a preference of seeing a player in one environment versus the other? Just talk a little bit about how you balance those two when you're trying to evaluate who that player is and whether or not they're a good fit.
Well, I think both have their benefits. I certainly think that one of the things I feel bad about for AAU coaches is I think AAU, there's a negative connotation with it more than probably what it deserves. There's negative aspects to high school basketball and AAU basketball, it's just like there's positives to both. I think one of the challenges for us at our level is, we can recruit a kid, all year, and they may not even be a part of a, significant AAU program. And by significant, I mean, one of the ones that's on a prominent circuit and that type of thing. And we can do a good job and get to that point before that May 1st deposit deadline that most schools encourage. And then we have these 2 live periods that are going on right now, and a kid can go and play for a more prominent team to help that team win games. And then, when they're part of that prominent team, that AAU coach may not have been a part of the process, the whole time. And, then you have another voice that enters the conversation in terms of the recruitment. And that can sometimes be a frustrating thing. Now by the same token, I think the fact that the players have a lot more places to play against really good players, I think that's a really positive thing about AAU. You really get a chance to go and see yourself outside of your normal circle of competition. So I know when I was growing up, like, I thought I was pretty good, but all I really played against was players in Central New York growing up in Syracuse. And my first experience outside of that, my comfort circle, was going to 5-star basketball camp in Pittsburgh. And I went down there and kind of got my tail kicked in. And I was like, wow, there's a big wide world out there outside of Syracuse, New York. So I think AAU provides a method for players to learn a lot about themselves and about their games. That's a really positive thing. From a high school perspective, what I look for is still, I think that's the most pure form of basketball, where the high school coach is probably a little bit more like the model that we have in college, because they're practicing 5 to 6 days a week. They're playing a schedule. They're doing summer leagues, team camps together. So that allows a coach, I think, to maybe see a player in a little bit more of a setting that would be like the college program. I think both have their benefits, and both have their challenges, but I firmly believe within recruiting, Mike, that it's an adapt or die portion of the job. I think we can complain as much as we want about the changing landscape of college basketball and the way people recruit, but the reality is, like, I'm not going to go do something different at this point in my life. So I got to figure this out, So, again, we try to do the best we can given whatever the landscape is. And I'm sure, if I'm lucky enough to be coaching another 10 or 15 years here, this is going to change again at some point.
Yeah, there's no doubt. I mean, it's going to be interesting to see just how, as you said, with these extra years of eligibility with COVID and the portal, and just kind of trying to figure out, okay, how's this whole thing going to settle out, and what's it going to look like? And, NIL, obviously, depending on your level and
sure,
where you're at, that's going to, I think, eventually that's going to settle down, and it's going to get figured out. But right now, it's just, in a lot of ways, it's just like the wild, wild west for you guys trying to figure out how to navigate the whole thing. And certainly different than it was 10 years ago. The landscape looks a lot different, and it certainly is going to look different 10 years from now. And as you said, you either adapt or you're going to get left behind, because there's going to be people out there that are going to adapt and make it work and figure it out. So let's talk a little bit about, once you get these guys on campus and you're putting together your team and you're trying to build it, and you're getting ready for a season. So let's kind of take it into the fall. As you're getting ready and you're thinking about what you want your team to look like and how you want your team to play. Obviously, you have offensive and defensive philosophy and the things that you normally do. But when you're thinking about one season with your personnel, how do you go about, what's the process for looking at, hey, here's what we have. What do we need to do? How do we need to tweak what we did in previous years to be able to take most advantage of the personnel that we have? What does that process look like for you and your staff trying to figure out what you're going to do in a particular season?
That's an awesome question. I'm going to tell you something that I think will be a little humorous. So I think of all the years I've been a head coach, every time I've sat down and mapped out what we're going to do, and then I look at the way our team looks in February,
doesn't look like it.
None of the things that I thought I wanted to do end up looking what our team looked like in February. So, I think that's a function of just Division III, where we don't have the time with them during the summer and during the off season. So I think it's probably a little bit easier for, teams at higher levels, I would imagine, to kind of figure things out because they have more time spent with their team. So, that's certainly one thing. I think another thing is at our level, because we've got so much time away from the players. I sit there like a lot of coaches. I watch Synergy. I'm watching the NBA. I'm watching all this stuff, and I'm going, I've got all this time to myself because I'm not interacting with the players on the court, where you almost to a point of paralyzation, you get all these ideas. And they're great ideas. They really are. And I go and meet with people and I talk to people and I do Zooms and all that stuff. And then, we eventually settle on something after watching our teams play. So those first 20 to 25 practices before we play our first game, those are probably the best fact-finding methods that we have within our program. There's a lot of different ways to do this, and for me, one of the things that we haven't deviated from within our practice model is we do at least 30 to 40 minutes of our 120-minute practice with player development every day. And that, to me, is so important because that's how I really learn about our players. I learn how they work and I learn what their skill set is. And, we certainly have a systematic approach to how we do things on offense and defense, that the core values don't change, but we do tweak how we play every single year, so, and so that's kind of how we get from point A to point B within our program. But again, I certainly collaborate with my assistant coaches. I think offense takes more time. That's the harder side of the ball for us to kind of figure out every year and to get to a certain point. I feel like our team consistently on an annual basis doesn't look great early on offensively. I think offense seems to be a little bit more of an abstract part of the game. Defense is a little bit more, you go here. And, it's a little bit more of tangible things. When this happens, this is what you do. And I wouldn't use the word easy, but it's a little bit easier to coach than the offensive end. Offense takes a little bit more patience, and you got to spend a little bit more time to get your team playing the way that you want them to play. So those are some thoughts on, how we eventually get to the tactical parts of how we want to look. But it's certainly tough. It's tough. And I really do think the change in the rules this year is going to be a game changer for our level, where we can work with the guys, albeit it may not seem like a ton of days. There's a lot that you can get done in that small amount of time. I really believe that.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think there's any question that just to be able to have that 8-day head start with guys in terms of putting things in and having them prepared and going through, and just as you said, being able to evaluate them through some of the player development stuff that you do, to me, that's going to give you, it's just going to be a huge bonus to be able to have your team ready to play for game one, as opposed to you're trying to rush and get as many things in, which, as you know, trying to get stuff in before the first game. I don't care what level of basketball you're in. That's always a challenge. It never feels like you have enough time.
Yeah. Well, this too, Mike. It's like part of this thing is not just the basketball thing. It's at our level. You look at like a sport like basketball, wrestling, hockey, ice hockey, like we're the only sports that don't have any contact with our players those first 6 weeks of school. And, I think a lot of coaches that may listen to this would probably agree. Like, I don't think there's a coach out there that hasn't dealt with a freshman that comes in that's homesick or it's just trying to find their way. And that contact that we can have with our players, I really think I don't think it can be underestimated with how important that's going to be. So I think we may, initially look at this as like, oh, it's a great thing from a basketball perspective. But I think in terms of relationship building, I think this is a whole nother level that our programs can get to, just in terms of the student athlete experience. I really think it's going to be a positive.
Yeah, it's a huge point, because I think, when you start talking about why a kid chooses a school, and we'd all like to think that every kid chooses a school for the academics and the environment and all these other different things that go into it. But the honest truth is that the basketball program, the basketball coach, oftentimes look, if you're being recruited as a basketball player, the coaching staff is a big part of why you end up choosing one school over another. And now you show up at the school, and those people who you built a relationship with in the recruiting process, suddenly now you can't have that contact with them. And so it does feel like you're almost doing those student athletes a disservice by not allowing them to have that contact with the people who probably had more to do with them attending that school than just about anybody else. And so I think you're right that from a psychological standpoint and from a orientation standpoint, and just getting those kids oriented to school, to me, I could see where that would be just invaluable when it comes to beyond the basketball court, but just helping them to adjust to being a college student, which we all know that beyond the basketball, just adjusting to being a college student for a lot of people, the freedom and just being able to manage your own time and keep on top of things and not having your mom and dad looking over your shoulder all the time. For a lot of kids, that's really difficult.
Absolutely. I think those things are the things that maybe go unnoticed. But, with basketball coaches, part of the reason that, we've worked so hard to get this rule passed was because of the things that maybe don't involve basketball. And I also think, part of the reasons why we could never get it passed, I think one of the only good things about COVID is we saw when we went to a days model that this could be a beneficial thing, because during COVID, we had opportunities to work with players during the off season for the first time, based on going to a model where instead of weeks, we use days, and we had contact with our athletes during a non-traditional segment. So, and we saw that it could be done from a facility perspective, from a perspective with our athletic trainers and things like that. So I think that had a lot to do with this thing finally getting passed. So, I'm excited to be a part of it. I really think this is going to be a good thing for our level.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, talk a little bit about player development. You mentioned it when you talked about practice, that you like to dedicate time every single day to player development. What does that look like for you? When you say player development, what are the kinds of things that you're talking about or that you're working with your guys on?
Well, I think when we coach, I think the hardest thing that we have to do is coach freshmen, coach first-year players in our program, because ultimately you get a first-year player, whether it's a transfer or a freshman, and you've got to mold them into the way that an ability to coexist within, the way that you want your program to function, right? So I've noticed with freshmen, like a couple of things that year to year, I just notice are something that we need to focus on to get them levels of improvement at is, being able to absorb contact. It's every time you go up levels, the physicality of the game changes, right? And then embracing the physicality of the game, So for us, when we do player development, most of the things that we do involve absorbing contact and playing more physical. I just think that's such an important part of the game. And it's not to say we don't work on the skill set that is involved by position for each player. We certainly do that. But I will say this, from having coached in the NCAA tournament, 7 times, is that, the deeper you get into the season, Mike, the more you have to have players that are able to make and finish plays. The later you play into a season, you've got to have guys that can do things on their own. They may have to coexist within your system and however you want to play, but they've got to be able to make plays and to finish plays. So our player development program exclusively revolves around getting these guys to where they feel confident enough and they can execute making plays on their own in a one-on-one fashion. That takes on a lot of different lives, from finishing to the way we move without the ball, the way we play with the ball in our hands, the way we read defenses, the way we play defense, in a one-on-one fashion. So we're teaching technique. And obviously I'm a big coach on shooting. We do a lot of shooting in our practices. I'm a big believer in that skill, being a difference maker in our game. So we do a lot of that as well.
When you're working on the ability to finish through contact, are you doing that through 1-on-1, 2-on-2, 3-on-3? Are you breaking it down like that? Are you working on specific skills where a player is working with a coach? Are you doing it positionally? Just what does that specifically look like in terms of how you're designing the drills for your kids to be able to work on finishing through contact? Just as
we match our athletes appropriately. So we want them to see some success early, and before we, put them in positions where they're going to go against an older or more physical player. So I think teaching the technique first is important, maybe 1-on-0. And then we add a defender. And then sometimes we add, we do go to an advanced technique where we add maybe 2 defenders, but we do it by position. We do it where we cross positions. And there's a lot of different ways that we teach that. A lot of things we've stolen over the years, a lot of things that we've made up on our own. I think, one of the things we believe in with any type of thing that we do with shooting, which finishing is a portion of shooting, is we're going to put them in positions where they're finishing plays or shooting shots that have play offensively. So those are the things that we try to focus on. But that's probably the number one thing that we do within our practices is the finishing drills. I think, basketball is a game of who is able to get the best shots in the game, and defensively, you're trying to force people into bad shots. Offensively, you're trying to get shots that are closer to the basket, trying to get shots that are, where you're going to the foul line, shots that are in transition and, odd man situations that favor the offense. So, offensive rebounding, all those things. So those are the things that we really practice every day.
Do you chart anything in practice?
No. We don't. Well, I shouldn't say that. We chart turnovers and offensive rebounds. We do that, and attempts at rebounding. So those are the 3 things that, when we have the managers that help us out and we have the manpower to do it, rebounding attempts, offensive rebounds, and turnovers. Those are the 3 things that we will chart.
Yeah, the manpower is always a challenge. I know it's one of the things that most of the coaching that I've done, Jason, in the last since I got out of high school coaching, now it's been more than 10 years, but, coaching my own kids, and typically it maybe me, or I have, another dad that's helping me out as an assistant. And I'm always have these great intentions of trying to be able to chart some things or keep track of stuff. And inevitably, even if I try to do that, I just end up coaching and forgetting about trying to chart stuff, or even trying to keep score of like competitive drills. Kids will be playing for 45 seconds. Kids will be like, "What's the score?" I'm like, "I don't know. You guys got to keep the score if we're going to keep it," because I have no idea. I'm just focused on trying to coach. So I'm always amazed by guys, especially if you have a small staff that can kind of keep track and really do a good job of tracking stuff, because I've never been able to do a very good job of that, even though I sometimes have the best of intentions to try it.
We don't do it in the games. I mean, I want my coaches coaching during the games. I think a really important function during the game, to me, something that I value is when players come out of the game, I want the coaches to coach them, so if they exit the game, and that's typically a very emotional time when kids come off the floor, whether they've made a mistake and that's why they're coming off the floor or not. I want my assistant coaches talking to them when they come off the floor. It's not maybe immediately, but eventually we want to give them some sort of a message. So when they go back in, they're able to execute whatever it is that we need them to do within their role within the team. So my assistants don't really chart anything other than I do have an assistant that does the fouls and the timeouts and that type of thing.
So do you assign then bench roles during games of here's what guy X is doing, here's what guy Y is doing? Or is it more just a case of, hey, this kid comes off and this coach saw something, and so that's the coach who pulls him aside and talks to him? Or how do you set that up on your bench on game day?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we identify all of our players, and there's some guys on our team that it's not going to be a good function for us to speak with them when they come out of the game, So we have, we coach every player individually, and in a way where, we know how they need to be coached, how they want to be coached, and how they best respond to communication. So we know ahead of time, okay, this is a guy that needs to be talked to. This is a guy we got maybe give him a minute. This is a guy that, I think really values feedback immediately when he comes out of the game. So that's been identified. We spend a ton of time. If I would have to communicate to you something what's the thing you spend most time with in your program? It's communication with these players, and getting to know them and how they respond and what motivates them. I just think the longer I do this, the more time I spend on communication and the less time I spend on tactics and technique. I just think in college basketball, connecting with people is just such an important function.
How do you teach communication amongst your players? Because I know, look, every coach that you talk to on any level always wants their players to communicate more. But I think one of the things that I know I don't always do well is you talk about, hey, we need you to talk more, we need you to communicate, but then we don't always teach what that looks like. And I think leadership is sort of the same way, where we'll say, hey, we want more leaders in our program, but then we don't always tell or show the kids what that actually looks like. So when you're talking about teaching communication, obviously you were discussing it when it comes to your staff communicating with players, but what about the player-to-player communication? How do you get that to the level that you want it to be?
Well, I think that we don't try to choreograph anything. I think you've got to have something where you trust the players. I don't think it's a part of your program that you can connect the dots all the time for the players. There's certain parts of that you have to let them figure out. So that I'm a big believer in that. But there are points in time, like one of the things, before our practice starts, we'll have a thought for the day, or we'll bring our players in a circle and we'll talk to them. And, I think just my experience when you're in a gym, okay, I think if you were to watch our team practice, in particular this last 2 years that we've had, record-setting years, you'd be able to see the joy within our gym, the joy in practice. We practice in a gym that's loud, it's boisterous. And we find time to recognize when the gym is vibrant, when players are talking, we say, this is what this is supposed to look like. Okay. And we need to find value in that. And, it's got to be authentic. It can't be something that's like, what I don't like is I don't like some of the stuff that I call it like rah-rah. It's kind of non-authentic. It's just, kind of standing up and, acting weird on the bench and jumping around and chest bumping and like that. That stuff to me, it's got to be authentic communication, and the players have to find value in that. And I think from a coaching perspective, when we see something going on that we really like and that we think is good and positive with respect to communication, we've got to find a way to point that out and say, okay, this is what we're after. It's not uncommon for us to make edits of like our bench during a game and say, okay, this is what we want our bench to look like in terms of positive interaction. Guys come out of the game, guys have positive interaction with one another. A good play happens in the game. We see our bench up and rooting on a teammate. Those types of things, but I'm very cautious about, choreographing that. I just don't think when a coach sticks their nose in that too much, I'm not sure that that's the best method to developing communication. But we certainly do emphasize having a loud gym during our practices and guys rooting each other on and talking to each other.
I love that idea of pointing it out when you see it, because I think a lot of times, again, you can talk about it and say, hey, this is what we want, but kids, as you know, don't always recognize or completely comprehend what it is that a coach is saying when they're talking about, hey, this is what it should look like. This is what it should sound like. But when they have it right in front of them, whether that's on film or whether you're stopping it in practice and saying, hey, this is what we want it to look like, to me, that's a powerful way of doing it. Because so often, and I think this goes to culture, or people talk about the pillars of their program and say, hey, we're about competitiveness, or we're about whatever it might be, pick any number of things that people put out as their pillars. And I think what you have to do is you have to attach behaviors to those things and be like, okay, well, here's where we're showing competitiveness. This is what that looks like. And then anytime that happens, as you said, you try to stop it, you try to point it out, you say, hey, this is what we're talking about. And then I think the more you recognize it and the more you praise it, the more of that you're going to get. And I think that goes along with, I really liked what you said about panning to the bench with the film and looking and saying, okay, look, we just made a three. Who's up on the bench cheering? Who's not up on the bench cheering? What do we get? What do we want our bench to look like in those situations? And I think you can carry that from the bench onto the court too, where you start talking about how you're going to play. And a lot of times I'm sure this is probably the way it was in your era, but I know when I was watching film as a player, most of that film work was negative. It was, hey, we're going to stop. We're going to watch this play where Mike screwed up and we're going to watch it 15 times and we're just going to keep watching it. And now I think coaches do a much better job of balancing out, hey, here's something that maybe we didn't do so well, but also pointing out, as you said, those things that you're doing positively. So when you're watching film with the players, how do you think about, or do you think about that balance between positive and negative plays? And then how much film are you sharing with the players? How much do they watch with you or together as a team?
We don't really watch film with the players. Our model in terms of, preparation for opponents, we'll watch 15 edits, the night before a game. We will go through within our practice, 3-on-3, 4-on-4, different actions throughout the year that we think we may see. But we really don't watch a ton of film with our team. We really don't. The times when we do watch film, it'll be a teaching thing. So for instance, before our season starts, we'll talk about bench decorum and make the edits that I just referred to show the team how we want them to coexist on the bench. There may be times if a player is struggling or if a player does something really well, an assistant coach might pull them in and show them 5 or 7 edits on something. If a player comes to us and says, Coach, can you watch film with me? The answer is always yes. And we do that, but we just don't watch a ton of film with the team. I just am not a huge believer in it. I just think at this level, again, I think the thing that I get most anxious about is burnout. And we never practice more than 3 days in a row, Mike. Without a day off after that. And we don't watch a ton of film. We'll get our lifts in 2 or 3 times a week. We never practice more than 2 hours a day. We don't do double sessions. But the 2 hours a day that we're in there is, I can't be more direct with you than telling you how competitive that environment is for those 2 hours. And one of the things I try to convey to our players is we can get a lot done in a little time if you're focused and you guys have buy-in to what, we're doing here, So the competitive level in our practices, I feel like is terrific, especially right now, with our talent level being what it is. And, but I'm a less is more guy,
What do you think is the key to building a competitive practice?
Well, I think that, for us, we play a lot, every coach has certain coaches that they really follow and believe in learning from. One of the guys that I really listen to and find great value in is Jeff Van Gundy. I grew up in Syracuse, so I've spent a lot of time, with Coach Boeheim and watching his practices. And, one of the common denominators, if I listen to a podcast with Jeff Van Gundy or if I talk to Coach Boeheim, is there's no shape like game shape, and we play a lot, our first 30 to 40 minutes is player development. Early in the season, we'll have some install of our offense, we certainly have some drills that we do, but we play a lot, and I think our players enjoy that. We play and we keep score. And I think that is, when I meet with my players individually and I ask them what they like about our practice model, every year, the thing that I hear the most is we like how much we scrimmage and we play.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. I think players today, right, they want to play the game. And clearly there's been a trend over the last 4 or 5 years, right, the games-based approach and using small-sided games and making the practices look more like the games. And that's how learning transfers, where I think in the past you might have done more drills on air or just working on individual moves without a defense. And I think people have realized that in a dynamic sport like basketball, the key to being successful is, you have to have the skill, but you also have to be able to know when to apply that skill. And so you have to be able to make decisions and then utilize the skill based on that decision making. And so I think that when you're playing and when you're scrimmaging and when you're going against a live defense, you're going to get much more out of that. And it's going to be more fun. I mean, ultimately, that's what it's going to be. It's going to be more fun, and players are going to be more competitive than they are if you're just, again, working on
absolutely. And I think there's a factor of boredom in practice. And I think the deeper you go into the season, I think, there's a monotony that can happen with drill work and voices and things like that. And I firmly believe in 5-on-5 play. I really do. So that's a big part of our model. Doesn't mean it's the only way to do it, but I've noticed that the longer I keep doing this, we really play a lot.
Do you think that helps players develop basketball IQ? And talk a little bit about what you think about when you think about helping players to develop a higher basketball IQ?
Well, the first reason we play 5-on-5 is I think it gets them in game shape. I think, we don't run line drills. We don't, I don't worry about our guys being in great physical condition when we play, But yeah, to your point, I really believe that the best way for them to learn how to read a defense, the best way for them to learn how to, score in, competitive defense, the best way for them to learn how to rotate properly defensively or to lock in and guard their man one-on-one is by playing in a game type situation. So, and not only do I believe that, but I collaborate with my assistants. I collaborate with, our players, and I ask them, here's what I believe is that I want the players to find practice to be, a function of what's going to make them most excited to be there. We all want the same thing, right? Like daily improvement is such an important part of a team growing together, right? So, we want to utilize practice in order to get not only the individuals better, but get the team better. And what better way to do that than by competing every day in that type of setting? So, yeah, I really believe that the guys get better at reading offense and defense, the tactics, the techniques. The more you put them in game situations, I think that's a really good thing. And they're locked in when they're playing.
Yeah, there's no doubt. I mean, I think that you're just going to get more out of them. I mean, anybody who's been a player, look, why do we all pick up a ball and start playing? Because we like to play, right? I mean, yeah, you got to put in work, and there's times where you're working individually that there's skill work to be done. But ultimately, the reason why kids picked up a ball when they were 5, 6 years old is because it was fun and because they were getting to play. And I think that's really what it's all about. We're coming towards an hour and a half, Jason. I want to ask you one final 2-part question. So part one is, when you look ahead over the next year or two, what do you see as being your biggest challenge? And then part two, when you think about what you get to do every single day, what about your job brings you the most joy? So your biggest challenge and then your biggest joy.
Well, my biggest challenge is developing freshmen. Our program is at a point. I think if you look at any program at our level, where we have guys that are here for 4 years, 5 years, the top 25, 30, 40 programs in the country, you're not relying on freshmen. You may have 1 or 2 that have an impact, but really freshmen still, typical to the way basketball was when we grew up, Mike. Sometimes they come in and they're highly touted, they're high profile recruits, and sometimes they don't get to play a lot, or they don't have the role that they're used to having in high school. And keeping them engaged and keeping them in your program, when they go through the ups and downs of a freshman year, both from a basketball perspective and from a perspective of just, getting used to being a college student, I think that's a challenge, and that's not getting easier, So I think that's probably my biggest challenge as a coach. My biggest joy is, honestly, for lack of complicatedness, is I genuinely love spending time with the players. I really do. When they come in and we spend time together, and I feel like I'm making an impact with them, and I can tell when they pop in and they sit down in my office and we talk, and there's a genuine, they're learning about me and I'm learning about them. Division III is such a unique model because typically our players don't play professionally. So you're watching them. That growth that takes place over a 4-year period is immeasurable, and you can't replicate that. Athletics is such a great thing on a college campus because there's things that they learn within your program that can't be replicated in a classroom setting, that are so applicable when they go out after graduation and get a job. And that just, that's just such a fun part of things. And, the second thing that brings me joy is I keep getting older and the kids I coach stay the same age. And that's kind of a cool job to have, I think.
That is, yeah. That's very cool. That's something that I think that we don't always think about, but yeah, it definitely keeps you young, and it keeps you, like, if we go back to the beginning, you got to adapt, right? Beginning of our conversation, we talked about having to adapt and change with the times. And certainly that's what coaching forces you to do on a lot of levels. It forces you to do that from a X's and O's strategic standpoint, but it also forces you to do that because times change, and just the way that you have to coach, and the young people that you're dealing with, they stay the same age, and we keep changing our perspective as we get older, but those kids are still looking to us for the same things, just a matter of how we deliver it to them.
Yep. Adaptability is a critical quality.
Absolutely. There's no question about it. All right. Before we get out, Jason, I want to give you a chance to share how people can get in touch with you. You want to share website, email, social media, whatever you feel comfortable with. And then after you do that, I will jump back in and wrap things up.
Thanks, Mike. Well, if anybody, feels the need to contact me and has any questions about our program, they can contact me by email at jason.leone, Leone, @oswego.edu. My Twitter handle is @Leone_coach. And my office line is 315-312-2379. So I'd love to hear from anybody that, has questions about, our program and how we do things. We've got a great group of guys, and really proud of the things we've done at Oswego State.
Jason, cannot thank you enough for taking the time out of your schedule tonight and being willing to jump on with us. Really appreciate it. And to everyone out there, Thanks for listening, and we will catch you on our next episode. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to the Hoop Heads podcast, presented by Head Start Basketball.